In the summer of 1678, as the Holy Roman Empire struggled against Ottoman threat and French ambition, a child was born who would inherit an empire at war. The birth took place in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, in a chamber lit by hundreds of candles, where Empress Eleanor Magdalene labored to bring forth the future of the Habsburg dynasty. Emperor Leopold I paced anxiously in the adjacent room, his characteristic Habsburg jaw set with worry and hope. When the midwife finally emerged with news of a healthy son, the relief that swept through the palace was palpable. This was no ordinary birth. This was the arrival of an heir to the most complex political entity in Europe, a patchwork empire of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, and dozens of other peoples, held together by little more than the person of the emperor himself. The infant was christened Joseph Jacob Ignatius Johann Anton Eustachius, a string of names that reflected the many saints and ancestors whose legacy he would carry. The baptism at St. Stephen's Cathedral was a grand affair, with cardinals in scarlet robes, nobles in their finest regalia, and representatives from Spain, for the Habsburgs ruled not only the Holy Roman Empire but also vast territories in the Iberian Peninsula and the New World. The cathedral filled with incense and sacred music as holy water touched the baby's forehead, marking him as a prince of the church as much as of the state. From his first breath, Joseph carried the weight of dynasty, the expectations of an ancient family that had ruled for centuries and intended to rule for centuries more. The world into which Joseph was born was one of constant danger and magnificent splendor. The Hofburg Palace where he spent his early years was a maze of chambers decorated with gilt and marble, where courtiers in elaborate wigs and embroidered coats competed for the emperor's attention. Young Joseph's nursery was filled with toy soldiers and miniature fortifications, for even in play, Joseph's education began in earnest when he was barely 5 years old. His tutors were Jesuits, learned men who believed that a prince must master languages, mathematics, history, theology, and the arts of war and peace. The young boy sat at a desk too large for him, struggling with Latin conjugations and Greek declensions, learning to write with a quill that seemed almost as long as his arm. He was a quick student, his tutors noted, with a particular gift for languages. By the time he was 8, Joseph could converse in German, Latin, French, and Italian, and was beginning to learn Spanish and Czech. These were not mere accomplishments of a precocious child. They were the necessary tools of empire, for a Habsburg ruler needed to speak to Germans in their tongue, negotiate with Italians in theirs, and pray in the universal Latin of the Church. But Joseph's childhood was not spent entirely in the schoolroom. In September 1683, when he was only 5 years old, the boy witnessed an event that would shape his understanding of the world forever. The Ottoman Empire, that vast Islamic power that had threatened Christian Europe for centuries, laid siege to Vienna with an army of 300,000 men. Young Joseph was taken to a window in the Hofburg, lifted up by his father so he could see the smoke rising from the suburbs, hear the distant thunder of Ottoman cannons. The child was both terrified and fascinated, his eyes wide as he watched soldiers rushing through the streets below, citizens fleeing with whatever possessions they could carry. For weeks, Vienna held its breath, wondering if the walls would hold, if the relief force would arrive in time, if the Habsburg capital would fall to the Sultan's warriors. Then came the news that seemed like a miracle. Jan Sobieski, the King of Poland, had arrived with his winged hussars, and alongside him fought a young prince named Eugene of Savoy. The combined Christian forces smashed into the Ottoman army, breaking their sie. The following year, Joseph met the man who would become the most important figure in his life outside his own family. Prince Eugene of Savoy was only 21, but he had already distinguished himself in battle against the Turks. When he was presented to the young Archduke, Eugene bowed with perfect courtly grace, but there was something different about him, an intensity in his eyes, a confidence in his bearing that set him apart from the usual parade of nobles seeking favor. Joseph, only 6 years old, was shy at first, but Eugene spoke to him not as to a child but as to a future commander. He let the boy touch his sword, told him stories of battle that were exciting without being frightening. And from that first meeting, a bond began to form that would last until Joseph's death. Eugene would become not just Joseph's greatest general but his mentor, his confidant, the man who would teach him that modern war required not just courage but intelligence, not just bravery but strategy. As Joseph grew from childhood into adolescence, his education expanded to include subjects his father considered essential for a future emperor. He sat in on meetings of the War Council, watching generals push markers across maps of the Balkans where Austrian forces were slowly pushing back the Ottoman tide. He learned about the complex finances of empire, how taxes were collected from dozens of different territories, each with its own laws and customs. He studied the genealogies of Europe's royal houses, learning which princesses might make suitable wives, which alliances might strengthen Habsburg power. And always there was the music. The Habsburgs were great patrons of the arts, and Joseph showed a genuine talent for composition, spending hours at the harpsichord working out melodies that pleased his mother and impressed his tutors. But beneath the surface of this privileged upbringing, there were tensions that would shape Joseph's character and his reign. His father Leopold was dead. Then came 1710, and the catastrophe that would break Joseph's heart. Smallpox swept through Vienna, that terrible disease that recognized no rank or privilege. It struck the imperial palace, and despite frantic efforts to protect the children, both of Joseph's daughters contracted the disease. First Maria Josepha died, then weeks later Maria Amalia. Joseph and Wilhelmine were shattered, their grief beyond anything courtly protocol could contain or express. The daughters they had loved, the bright spots in the grim world of war and politics, were gone, wrapped in white shrouds and buried in the imperial crypt. Joseph tried to bury himself in work, reading dispatches late into the night, but colleagues noticed his changed demeanor, harder, more driven, as if he could somehow make meaning from loss through victory in war. The grief seemed to harden Joseph's resolve in the war. He pushed for continued military pressure, refused peace negotiations that might have ended the conflict on reasonable terms. Perhaps he was seeking some kind of redemption through victory, some way to make the losses meaningful. Eugene, who understood his emperor's pain, supported him but worried privately that Joseph was driving himself too hard, that the combination of grief and overwork was taking a physical toll. The emperor who had seemed so vital and energetic now looked tired, older than his years. His 32nd birthday in July 1710 passed quietly, a modest celebration with family. Joseph felt unwell but attributed it to stress and grief. He pushed through the discomfort, maintained his punishing schedule of meetings and decisions. The war continued through another winter, armies freezing in their positions, both sides exhausted but neither willing to give way. Joseph reviewed reports of frozen soldiers, of supply shortages, of the grinding misery of siege warfare, and his